Hi, everyone. I'm Dave Philippi, the Director of Film and Video at the Wexner Center for the Arts. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this special conversation around the release of the new documentary, Aggie, about the great philanthropist and collector Agnes Gunn. And obviously we're having a little bit of a, there we go. We're still waiting for Catherine, but we thought instead of having everyone continue to wait, we'll get the panel going and they'll join us as soon as they can. But thank you once again for joining us. I hope you all had a chance to watch the terrific film that's been available thanks to Marcus Hu and Strand Releasing over the weekend. And sit back and enjoy the conversation. We'll save some time at the end for question and answer. And now I would like to turn things over to the director of the Wexner Center, Johanna Burton.
Hello, everybody. So sorry for the delay on our end. We had a sort of issue moving from one room to another virtually, but here we are, and this is where we want to be. So as Dave mentioned, we're going to leave a little bit of time for Q&A that will happen through the chat. So don't feel you need to wait to ask questions. We'll get to those as soon as we can. Before I introduce our panel tonight, I want to thank the WEX donors, members, and board members who have joined us tonight. Though we can't be together in person, I'm thrilled that we can join virtually, coming together from points all over the map to share this moment. And more than that, it's your investment that keeps the WEX moving forward in our mission to provide support for the art and artists of our time. I'm honored to be leading this conversation and discussing Aggie, the absolutely breathtaking documentary from director Catherine Gund, who has joined us tonight. Aggie is not just a lovely showcase of Aggie's extraordinary life, but the film raises crucial questions of art, justice, inclusion, diversity, and access. Glenn Ligon really wonderfully joins us tonight. He's a remarkable artist who's featured in the film and a familiar face to WEX fans. Glenn's exhibition, Some Changes, was in our galleries in 2007. We're thrilled to have you with us, Glenn. And also we're lucky to have with us the film's co-producer, Tanya Selvaratnum, who has engaged with many projects around these topics and is an old friend. So I'm delighted also to have her here. There's Catherine just in time. So here we all are. And thank you to everybody. I'm just going to kick this right off with a question for Glenn, actually. So each of these conversations, and you've been doing a number of them, Catherine and Tanya, you can talk about this a bit later, have had really different constitutions. And depending on who's in each of the virtual rooms, you end up focusing on different things. I wanted to really use the opportunity to talk to Glenn, who I found to be absolutely riveting in the film, and to ask some of the questions that I stood alongside the longest. So Glenn, you incisively comment in the film on the discrepancy between institutions saying that they're committed to showing artists of color and acquisition dates that would say otherwise. How are museums changing infrastructurally? Acquisition, staffing, support are just part of that equation. And are we truly seeing a historic change in reflexive thinking around the role of museums and culture? I just want to hear you talk more about that. I thought it was really interesting.
Well, thank you. First, thank you for inviting me to the conversation. Glad to have been part of the film and glad to be in a discussion around it at the Wexner. You know, in a way, it's kind of a joke when I said that, you know, when you go to museums, you know, when I go to the museums, I look at the acquisition dates, but in a way it's quite true, because I feel like often when I'm at museums and looking at the work of artists of color, I notice that either the work was acquired very recently or it was acquired a long, long time ago and I've never seen it. So there's this strange sort of thing of like, you know, just at museum today, and I saw an amazing painting by an artist named Benny Andrews, African-American painter, acquired at the time, 75, 76, hadn't been shown until about 3 years ago, you know? So I think there is this kind of, you know, museums have huge collections. They can't show everything, but I feel like there's a kind of gap in terms of like the acquisition of artists of color versus when they're actually on the walls. And I think museums are trying to correct that now, but it's kind of too late, you know, which isn't to say that they shouldn't show the work they have and they shouldn't be acquiring work, but for someone of my generation growing up, it would have been super important for me to have seen that Benny Andrews painting, to have seen that Alma Thomas painting, to have seen that Faith Ringgold at the time when I was a young artist as role models for the possibility of just even being an artist. And now I'm grateful to see that work, more and more in the museum spaces, but I also find it slightly problematic that museums of recently have been de-acquisitioning work to buy artists of color, which again, not a bad thing, buying artists of color, but wondering why museum trustees aren't putting up the money that they put up to buy the Rothko, to buy the Bryce Martin, to buy the Richard Serra, why that money isn't being sort of generated to buy the Adrian Piper, David Hammonds, why they have to sell a Rothko, to buy a Negro, I mean, that's a big issue for me. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about when I think about museum acquisitions.
Excellent. Thank you. And just a follow-up question, because you also pointed in that sort of passage in the film to the importance of changing curatorial staff, changing staffing in general. Can you say, or anyone, Catherine or Tanya too, I think that's another piece of this conversation, and you seemed hopeful on that front, and that changes are happening that feel like they are making progress, and I think certainly that's a conversation we should all be having in terms of that structure.
Right. Well, I think that there are amazing people of color who are entering the curatorial world, many of which I've worked with, and many more coming along the pipeline. So I think I'm hopeful in that sense, is that the talent is out there, because before the argument was there's no talent out there, And I remember being in a discussion about this very issue. And as we were talking, I just started making a list, of like names of curators, and I just like curators of color. And as I was making my list, I said, what do all these people have in common? Oh, they've all worked at the Studio Museum in Harlem.
Right.
Right. So in a way, it's about Thelma Golden and the Studio Museum being a training ground for Naomi Beckwith, curators like that who've gone on to other museums, Thomas Lax, Keeley and Susan Boston, thinking through how do we make pipelines for people to enter the field? Because I feel like a lot of institutions don't want to grow things. They just want to harvest things, So Thomas Lax wasn't Thomas Lax until he was trained to be, trained to be the amazing curator at MoMA that he is. But he didn't come out of nowhere. He had to have this kind of training, And so I think that's super important in terms of bringing people into the field. They have to grow up somewhere. And I think a lot of times the big institutions don't want to mentor. They just want to take people fully formed.
Absolutely. No, it's a very interesting point. I wondered actually, Glenn, just to put you on the spot for one more minute, but to ask Tanya and Catherine a little bit about this. Your work, the works that show up in the film are really these very beautiful pieces, and pieces that I love very much. Can we talk a little bit? I love something, and Catherine, maybe you can talk about this. You chose to use the artworks in this abundant, gorgeous way without a lot of commentary about each of them. So will you just talk about Glenn's work in the film, and how then overall the strategy to utilize the works in the way that you did came about? Because I found it to be extremely lush, but also it didn't over-determine any of the work itself.
That's a wonderful question, because it's really coming from someone who understands the artwork and what the references can be and what the emotion can be. And I think it was really important to me to use the art as itself, as a puncturing, as an aerating a way into this other world, not illustration of what we were saying, but more about sort of a feeling, a reference, an echo, a resonance. And so, I think about Glenn's pieces are so ideal in the film, because they occupy that space between what Aggie might articulate and where we're going. And it goes back to that quote that you referenced about of Ava's quote at the beginning, which bookends the film at the beginning and the end, which is what do artists and activists, what is art and how do art and justice relate to each other? And she said they're both the same thing. They're about looking into the future, into an empty space, and seeing something that could be that doesn't already exist, and believing that it could be, and then making it so. And so I think, I hope that Glenn will speak about a couple of his pieces, but one of his pieces that is very deep for me in the film and embedded is the With Hope piece. And that one I know was actually how Bryan Stevenson, one of the most important leaders and guides of our day, signed his book, signed something to Glenn that said "With Hope, Bryan." And it's actually that "With Hope" is Bryan's signature. That's his sign off. But it's also why I think that film about Aggie is so important and magical right now, and so differently meaningful than it might have been a year ago, or certainly 4 years ago, and maybe in the future. But right now, what we need is this sense of belonging, and what that is doing is giving us this notion that there is a future that's worth believing in.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about that work with Hope was that I was at a book signing sponsored by Darren Walker, the Ford Foundation, to celebrate Bryan Stevenson's memoir, Just Mercy. And Bryan signed the book for me, as you said. And he said, to Glenn, "With Hope, Bryan Stevenson." And I looked at that "With Hope" and I thought, oh, I can make a neon in his handwriting as a benefit edition for Equal Justice Initiative. And all of that came from thinking about Aggie's philanthropy. Aggie selling a Liechtenstein painting to go to organizations and individuals who are fighting for justice. And I thought, I can do some small version of that, make this neon that all the proceeds will go to Equal Justice Initiative. So I was in some ways very inspired by Aggie's example to make that work.
That's beautiful. Tanya, you and Catherine have made a lot of work together over the years, and you've certainly had dialogues for a long time. How has this project evolved for you two?
Well, this project is, it's a very emotional project for me to have been involved with, to have been entrusted to help Catherine make it. It was such a beautiful, organic evolution to becoming a movie. And what Glenn and Catherine were talking about with artists inspiring other artists, with Bryan Stevenson inspiring him, and with this film with Ava DuVernay's 13th inspiring Aggie to sell her art, the Liechtenstein to fund the Art for Justice Fund. The interconnectedness of all of this, to me, is very beautiful. And the interconnectedness of the films that Catherine and I have made together, and the way that they kind of exist side by side, is also really beautiful. Going back to What's on Your Plate, and then Born to Fly with Elizabeth Streb, just these films that have a lot of heart, and that also show how people and who are inspired to do something to change the world can actually take action. And I think that what Aggie did, Alex Herzon, I cite the line that she says in the film so much, which is that Aggie really is an example of like a rallying cry to just throw down your glove and do something. And the way that Catherine and I came together around this film was really casual. Like, let's film Aggie in conversation with the people in her life. That was it. It was not to make a movie, but after every filming, I would say it feels like we're making a movie. And then one day it became very clear. And it's just so gratifying to have it come out now at this very bizarre time, but also a very appropriate time. where people need to be inspired about the power of art and the connectedness of art and justice.
Yeah, it's interesting. Catherine did mention that you kept insisting it was a movie, and she kept insisting it was not a movie, and then it became a movie, of course. But what you described, to borrow another word of Brian Stevenson's, is proximity, and that's relationship. So there's something, and I think, Catherine, you brought that up as well, this idea that if somebody is exposed to an idea, maybe it's something that spreads, and that's through relationships and one-to-one interactions, which I think is a beautiful part of the story that Aggie tells, which is friendships. And Glenn, something that you also point to that I think is incredibly important with this story, and you can all speak to, is the depth model with which Aggie approaches artists. And so, Catherine, you had a great quote about this, and I wondered if you could share it.
Wait, which one?
Oh, sorry. See, I'm doing my research.
I'm like a great quote about relationship.
No, just about Glenn in one of the conversations with Aggie, talking about how she actually wanted to see the process.
It's so important. Thank you, because that is important. And I was still stuck on this idea of curators are going to save us. And I believe that's true.
Yeah.
And because I also believe that critics are going to save us. And there's been a lot of work done about critics and films, and how, for example, Green Book, which goes to a big, huge festival and gets a few big reviews by mainstream white critics who say this is the godsend film. And by the time people who are impacted by this story and have knowledge about this story are talking about it, nobody's reading those anymore. And suddenly Green Book gets the best film. So I think that curators, critics, it does relate to your new question, but it was also, I was still hanging on.
Yeah.
When was talking about it, I was like, yes, because it is really an ecology. It's a whole group of people. And whether that's Glenn and Aggie or me and Tanya, I mean, so what I do, I actually have Glenn's quote right here, because it was an amazing thing. And as Tanya said, we weren't making a movie. We started filming, originally it was just me interviewing Aggie. One of those was bad. That was the end. So we started recording with my children, talking to her, and all four of them appear in the film. And then she was like, oh, I could do this. Because I wanted to record some conversations. She's not on film. I think everyone should go ask each other, not just elders, but just talk more. And I actually think at this time we are spending our time making more of our moments together, because people can only withstand 1 hour on Zoom. So talk about real things. And so then different people came in, and Glenn came in, and artists and different people, and we started talking to people, and it was in those relationships that define who Aggie is. And really, after probably 10 of them, Tanya just insisted and said, this is a movie. If you're not going to make a movie, we're going to make a series. And I was like, no, we're not making a series. Let's just make one movie. But, and then we ended up filming over 35 conversations. So the point you're talking about is that Aggie has always told me that she collects contemporary art because she wants to know the artist.
Yeah.
And Glenn said this beautiful thing. He said, if someone has a relationship with the artist and knows what the artist is up to, they'll see that sometimes what the arts think is the most important work is not what the market, is not what the market thinks is the most important work. So the artist and the market might be going in completely different directions, right? The market says, we'll get $1 million for that thing. And Glenn is thinking, I think it's always more interesting to have that kind of relationship so you can see what the artist has learned from, even in their own work. I've kept some pieces where I thought this is not the best piece in terms of the market, what a gallerist or what a collector would want, but it's the piece I've learned the most from. Why would you not want to know what Glenn is learning from to make his next work? And that is where Aggie's delving in. He says, it's the piece that I can see new work coming out of. And I think a good collector, they get into the artist's head like that. And Glenn, maybe you can talk, there aren't a lot of collectors that are willing to get into your head like that.
Well, I think it's just about also trusting someone that, that this making art is thinking. So you have to trust someone, a curator, a dealer, a collector to think with you about the work. So there's a lot of stuff I never show anyone, but I will show something to Aggie because I value her opinion, the way I show things to artist friends that I would never show to a dealer or someone else, you know? So it's about trusting that someone gets that the intellectual process behind making an artwork is as interesting as the final product, and that the final product may not be as good as some other final product, you know, but I'm serious about that oftentimes the things that I keep in the studio are the things that maybe don't quite work, but I see so many possibilities for other work in. And I think it's really special when you have someone like Aggie that wants to see those things, not to collect them, but to understand in greater depth what the work is about, you know, what the intellectual underpinnings of the work are. And that, I found that is actually rare.
I was just gonna say, Glenn, like what you were just saying made me think like how rare Aggie is in the art world ecosystem, how like it is very innate for her to be intentional in questioning and being curious and really trying to you know, dismantle in her own way very entrenched patriarchal and racist structures. And what we were talking about earlier with the, you know, critics and curators pipeline and how corrupted that has been. There's been a question posted in the chat about the Whitney Museum BIPOC fiasco, and I am curious to hear us talk about that. But what I would say is that with regard to the film, I think what becomes especially relevant and important about it is that, yes, we're exploring Aggie and her philanthropy and her commitment to art and justice, but we're also really exposing what more people in the art world should be doing. And that's when I go back to Alex Herzon's rallying cry, because until we take apart this system, we won't be able to like remake it in a way that's going to make sense, especially after this year.
I think, you know, Billy Wright asks this question, which Tanya just spoke to, which I think is a really important one. How there's this progress in some sense, and in certain areas, the studio museum are leading, and then there are other. I think the museum world is a hotspot and kind of a case study for what's going on in the world around us. You know, there's a quote, Catherine, and I'm going to quote you from another. I was lucky enough to be on the CCL conversation around Aggie, and you said that actually the end goal for the work that you are doing and Aggie is doing, and that we all hope to see done, would get rid of philanthropy, because philanthropy is actually part of the very problem that it's trying to solve. And so I think that this question is a really interesting one when it comes down to, are you modeling behaviors that people then actually follow suit, or do they think it's taken care of and so they don't have to participate? I wondered if you could talk about that, because I certainly do think that there's something very, at once, it's amazing and iconic that Aggie is Aggie, but there's one Aggie, right? So how is it that we start to, and you began to talk about this a little bit through modeling, I think, and Tanya, it's what you're getting to as well. How do we inspire behavior that then in a funny way renders itself obsolete through the system? So Catherine, do you mind? Because I thought that was a fantastic way to talk about philanthropy and the way that we're moving, but I wanted to hear more about it.
Johanna, there's so many questions in what you just said. So first, I mean, it's a great question, and it is actually the crux of the work that we're doing right now. Because as Glenn says in the film, I think you've sort of shown shame to the art world. Like, you've introduced this notion that people need to not only look at where they are, but actually give something up. And I don't mean as literal as the film. I mean, like, give up space, give up leadership. And we're seeing it very specifically in the art world, in a lot of your art institutions right now, that it's not just a question of adding someone to the table. It's actually stepping back and letting there be a whole vision for what's going to happen. And I think that, you know, what's interesting to me is how part of your question, which really tipped me off, and I was like, that's a whole other part, is this very patronizing notion that Aggie's taken care of it.
Right.
Aggie's dealt with this one little part. And what I love in the film is when Rue says, it's so obvious. Like, why is this the first? So to answer your actual question, which was about how do we get rid of philanthropy? It's not that I want to get rid of philanthropy.
No, of course.
The idea of philanthropy really is about taking care of each other. And I think COVID has introduced on a much broader scale all kinds of notions about mutual aid and the fact that we're all philanthropists. We take care of our families, we take care of each other, we take care of our communities, we're taking care of our schools, our students, our teachers. I mean, it starts right here and moves out. What you're referencing is the idea that philanthropy, the financial philanthropy, is based on a system of inequality and extraction. And that if we are actually using philanthropy to fight for economic equality, that there will then be no need for philanthropy if we're successful, because there won't be people with more than they need, and there won't be people with less than they need. And that is supposedly the structure of philanthropy. And then we go, and traditional philanthropy is about maintaining the structures that keep some people with museums and parks and universities. I mean, people go to these fancy universities, many of us, and then give money to those universities, not to the places where poor kids and working class children are being educated. They give to the universities where the rich kids are being educated. So as you spoke about earlier, it's like a hospital that only treats well people. You know, we don't need more of those, and that's not going to actually address the issues that we're talking about.
And I think part of what Kat's getting at too is the very transactional nature of philanthropy that is really being exploded right now. That in order for somebody to be generous, they have to get something in return, which is like which the art world is, you know, very much culpable of, the whole nature of the, you know, the benefit auction. You know, like that an artist has to donate a work for a philanthropist to buy in order for a cause to get a contribution that it so deeply needs. I mean, this transactional nature of philanthropy is one that we really do have to question and explode. But that is a very hard thing for philanthropists to do, because it requires them to take responsibility for their own greed.
Well, one of my favorite moments, there are a lot of favorite, oh, sorry, Catherine, go ahead.
I was just going to add one tiny thing to that, which I loved, which was that, you know, several people in the reviews and in comments and in our community have said, you know, we need more Aggies. And yes, I would love to have more Aggies. But what I loved was when an artist who appears in the film, Teresita Fernandez, we did a conversation the other night, and we talk a lot, we're close friends. She said, I am Aggie. And that's what I'm going for with the film. It's not this notion that we need to get the, you know, 1,000 or less people who have a hugely expensive painting on their wall to sell their painting. It's that I actually want everyone to realize that they are Glenn and they are Tanya and they are Johanna, that what they can do, you know, when Glenn says, I couldn't even buy my own painting, he can't buy his own paintings.
Yeah.
But he can participate by taking the signature of Brian Stevenson, you know, the Martin Luther King of our day, and take this signature and make this neon and sell it to people and contribute to the Equal Justice Initiative, which is not just lawyers, defense lawyers, which is how they began, but now they have a memorial, they have a museum, the cultural change, the narrative change. He made a movie, he made a book. Like, he's in this storytelling with us, and Glenn has a role in that. And he doesn't need to have a painting by Roy Lichtenstein that's worth $165 million on his wall.
Well, that makes me think, like, if only Brian Stevenson were all the cultural critics of America, because I really think of him as a culture critic, not just a justice warrior.
That's interesting. I just wanted to just interject with one quote that's in the film from Darren Walker. And he says, philanthropy inspired by generosity versus philanthropy inspired by justice. And the difference in that, you know, like people can be generous in terms of philanthropy, but to do philanthropy inspired by justice is a different thing. You know, it has different parameters. It looks different, you know. So I think that's some of the things that the film is trying to get at.
It's funny. What I was going to say is that one of my favorite parts of the film is when, you know, obviously the story of telling that the Liechtenstein happens, which, by the way, we're huge Liechtenstein fans here in Ohio, as you know, and I think some of the foundation folks are even with us tonight. That the reaction, I mean, Aggie says, everyone says, why would you do that? What do you mean you're starting Art for Justice? Why are you going to the prisons? It's exactly what you're talking about, which is there's a reversal of the kind of expectation that she would sell the painting to buy more art by whomever, but instead invests directly into the system that she's engaged with, but without distancing it from art or making those things separate. And it is a spend down fund, right? Which is also really an interesting, to me, that's a very interesting point. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, but that also enables discussions about how others need to step in to watch a spend down that I think otherwise in other places would have been handled differently. So I just, Glenn, to your point, I think that's that difference between generosity and justice, how there's a pointed decision, but also call for action, I think. And maybe we can talk a little bit about where Art for Justice is in this moment. I'd love to hear.
Again, there's so many questions in your question, but from generosity to justice, and the spend down notion is really different, is that Art for Justice, $100 million to spent in 5 years.
Yep.
That was in response to many things. One is that if you're actually fighting to end mass incarceration, you don't want it to go for 20 years.
Right.
So you're not creating an endowment that goes, you know, in perpetuity.
Right.
You get that. The other part I think really is relevant to this conversation is that it's kind of a reparations approach. It's about saying, here's this money. It needs in the field, the people who are the artists and activists who are doing the work and conceiving of this, visioning this abolitionist future, however we get there. That is the future we all should share. If we don't, that however we get there, the people on the ground are the ones that know how to get there. The people closest to the problems are closest to the solutions, and the furthest from the resources. And Aggie's saying, let's put it out there. Let's get it out there. So Art for Justice, quickly, I will just update by saying that Aggie did start it by saying to her peers and other collectors and philanthropists, please join me. And 30 people and couples did join from the very beginning as founding donors. And then she would never, to Tanya's point, ask artists to give. She would never do that. She would ask the collectors, the gallerists, whatever. And what she did was create this beloved community that made people want to be a part of it. And Mark Bradford, to his beautiful, soulful credit, and Glenn was there, came along and met a couple of the artists who are our fellows and said, I want to participate in this. The Ford Foundation has been so generous, and Darren, to cover all staffing and administration. So every dollar that comes into Art for Justice goes right to the field. And Mark Bradford made an edition and sold 40 pieces and raised $1 million for Art for Justice, gave every penny, his gallery, Hauser and Wirth, charged no fees, and the entire $1 million went to the fund. And since then, we've had a lot of artists, including actually artists who are artist fellows of Art for Justice, Dwayne Betts and Titus Kafar, who gave a piece from their edition that we funded, and they gave that back to the community. And since then, we have Julie Meritu and Jeff Koons and Mark DeSuvera. There are a lot of artists who are giving work. And I say that to raise up the artists, not to say that artists are the people who, for the most part, should be funding Art for Justice. But I do think that it's this kind of amazing community that is created by someone like Aggie, and the work of the community, of the beloved community of the Art for Justice grantee fellows and grantee partners. And that those are the people, the artists and activists, who are really getting the work done, including Brian Stevenson. And for that, it becomes an attractive community to be a part of, whether you're a donor, artist, activist, or all three, which I think most people are identifying as.
It's terrific. We have a question from somebody who's a good friend of the Wex, Jessica Burton. She's asking, what do you think is hindering others in similar positions as Aggies to follow her example in the blatant way that she has?
Glenn, Tanya.
Difficult. I think it's something you mentioned before. Philanthropy can be transactional. And so the model is set up, you give a work, you give money, you get a name on a wall, in a museum space. That's the normal model. And it's hard to think outside of that model for lots of different reasons. But also I think it's because it's something Aggie said. I can't remember if she said it to me or it's in the film, but, and you said it, Kat, people were saying to Aggie, you're gonna go to a prison? Why? Don't those people, they're in jail. Didn't they do something wrong? So there's this sense of like, you're not supposed to extend yourself to certain areas, like you just give your money somewhere and then you're done, And Aggie's model is, no, I wanna see what's going on in these spaces. I don't wanna just hear about, incarcerated people. I want to see what it is like. I want to talk to people. I want to be amongst them. And I think there's a resistance, frankly, from a lot of people who have a lot of privilege and access from recognizing that that is a huge part of what this society has created and what this society is about, because it fundamentally means you have to think differently about your own position.
Yeah, and I would add to that, in an optimistic, through an optimistic lens, there are many philanthropists who do hold a light to Aggie's example. Mm-hmm. So we should be mindful that there are many who do the right thing without being forced to. But taking through a cynical lens, there are far more who don't do the right thing because they don't have to, because they have entitlement, because they have impunity, and because it's hard for them to put themselves in other people's shoes. It's what Darren Walker talks about with regard to empathy. I think people understand the notion of sympathy, but empathy is a word that I feel is still somewhat abstract. It's hard to, it's really actually hard to explain unless you experience it yourself. And I'd be curious what Glenn and Catherine think about this, but it's such a hard thing to teach. And like I hear it so much on the campaign trail right now because of the erosion of empathy that has been persistent, not just the last few years, but over the last few centuries, the dehumanizing of people. And I think that when you have, money and real estate kind of ruined the world, those two concepts. So because of our hierarchical structures, we've facilitated this total devaluation of empathy.
I think go ahead, Glenn.
Oh no, I was just gonna, as Tanya was speaking, I was thinking of a Basquiat piece where he says, plush, safe, he thinks. The idea that, that wealth gives you a certain kind of safety in the society, or you think you have a certain kind of safety, that you'll never be in the position that those unfortunate people are in. But also I think, what was interesting to me to hear in the film as I watched it again was Aggie saying after George Floyd's murder, she said, oh, I was having dreams where I couldn't breathe. That's empathy.
Yeah, Eric Garner, yes.
Sorry, Eric Garner.
Same. I mean, it's like it repeats over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And it became the mantra of the movement. I mean, I think that it is about economy because it's about segregation. And that goes back to what you invoked, Glenn, from proximity and Brian's idea of proximity. That to me, one of the most moving parts of the film is when Aggie responds to Darren when he says, she says, do you have people who think Art for Justice is a bad idea? And he says, of course. And people think you go to prison, you did something wrong, you go to jail. And she says, it's just such a bald, it's such a pure Aggie moment. And she just says, have they ever been to one? Because there is no way in her vast imagination that she could picture someone who knows what's going on inside the prisons and jails in this country, who would believe that it was a humane way to treat someone. And it's that bit of proximity where she's like, I've been there. And you cannot cage a human being. When she goes into prison, she sees an artist. She sees artists and scientists and teachers and people who could help us solve our current problems. And, you know, it's not even like, to me, the empathy, yes, that's a first step. It's primary, but we have to go further than that. And that it's like this, there's something where Aggie takes it beyond empathy, which isn't just, I will walk in someone else's shoes, but I acknowledge that all people have something to contribute. I mean, I challenge any of us to actually believe that, to think about that, to try to internalize that every single person that you disagree with, that you don't like, that you fear, that those people all have something to contribute, and they have a place and a role in our society. And if we can actually acknowledge that, we would be completely different.
Yeah, and I know that we don't have much more time left, but there's this powerful moment in the film where that I also find one of the most vulnerable moments, where Aggie talks about her own ignorance when she was growing up in Ohio and not knowing the story of Henrietta, who worked in her family home. And I'd be curious if there's anything, Kat, you'd want to say about that, because that to me is a really beautiful turning point where you realize that Aggie herself had to go through an awakening to get to where the person she is now.
Yeah, I mean, I think awakening is the perfect way to talk about the current moment, that it's about epiphanies, it's about reckonings, and it's about awakenings, and in various orders. And to me, the story about Henrietta always comes back to her knowing that there was something else. That, you know, she couldn't represent her own family because Aggie didn't know her family. She wasn't encouraged to nurture her relationship with Henrietta. Henrietta cleaned and cooked, and she knew she was somebody who had something to do with where the food was coming from. But I think there was a part of Aggie that knew that there was this other place, and that there was a different, like not everybody lived with their 5 siblings in the countryside with the donkey and a governess and food cooked every day for them by someone other than their mother. There was like a way that she knew she lived someplace else. Everyone else in her home, she was very sheltered, and they were removed from the downtowns of the area. And I think that she knew that this woman came from someplace else. She came on the rapid transit. She came from a different town, and she had a family, and even if Aggie didn't know it. And so that's what I feel like Henrietta represents for me in terms of Aggie, is always knowing there was another place. And she did that when she went off to that high school, and she knew she was different, and she felt different. She always felt like an outsider, which to me, I knew what that felt like as a young, dykey tomboy. I was a boy. I was a boy. And I knew, you know, that everyone else treated me like a girl, and I was a boy. And I think that Aggie somehow knew she was outside, and it's that same visioning, like, you know, there's this mainstream narrative and you're not part of it. And I think she's always not been chasing that, but been understanding this perspective.
I did one of my favorite parts. I'm saying this over and over, so I clearly have a lot of favorite parts, but was the footage of you taking her to the PFLAG rally. And it made me really curious. Did you always have this relationship where you could she was such a groundbreaker for herself. She left her husband and came with 4 kids to New York because she knew she wanted to be part of the art world, and she carried that with her. Was there anything about that was difficult as a child of Aggie, or was it actually just, I mean, it looks wonderful. So I'm curious.
I mean, you know, divorce and sexism are not wonderful and easy. And
right.
I think, you know, I mean, I appreciate, I'm not,
I mean, being her child seemed wonderful.
I mean, there is the wonderful, I think I realized the wonderful more as I
Yeah.
and realized that, you know, not only did most of my friends get criticized, disowned, dehumanized,
Yeah.
you know, smalled, made
Yeah.
small when they came out by their family, made small, like that they didn't matter.
Yeah.
And that was not a part of it. And I think there was a way that her ability to see that humanity came early, and it came before me.
Yeah.
And so that when I was able to say, you know, here I am. I mean, I really felt like I did anything I wanted to do. And at the time she was like, oh, you're a little radical. Why do you have to be militant? She kept using that word when I was younger. But, you know, and I just thought, well, I'm militant, you still love me, so I'm going to go with my gut and do that.
Yeah.
So, you know, it was that she kept coming with me. And as a mother, you know, she had 4 kids, I have 4 kids. It is the number one lesson I learned from her was that I need to grow. I don't know all the things, and that I can change. I can change my opinion. I can change how I act. I can change how I look. Like I had very short blonde hair. You know, you can change and you can grow and you can do what you want. You know, she still does that, right, Glenn? I mean, you know, she's like, Glenn is one of Aggie's favorite people in the world. And I think she sits with him and talks to him and she learns from him and she asks him questions. Part of what I cut out of their interview, and everyone's actually, was her asking them questions.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Hard, difficult questions. Yeah. But she's curious, as you said, she wants to know, she wants to change, she learns from other people. It's a great class, and it's really nice to hear you, Kat, talk about that preceded, you know, you being there, because sometimes parents have to catch up with their children's aspirations and dreams, but sometimes the parents they're already there. They're already making space for this other life, you know, and it seems like Aggie was that kind of person. Like she imagined like she needed to make space for you and her other kids to grow into the people they wanted to be, which was different than who she was. So that's an extraordinary self-knowledge and gift, I think. You know?
Well, and also for me, having been a fly on the wall during these conversations, the thing that really struck me is what I've experienced from Aggie too, which is just her acceptance of everybody as they are, like just accepting people on their own terms. But the other thing that really struck me, in addition to her curiosity, was that she's kind of naughty. Like she's like kind of mischievous, and that sense of mischief makes it like she enjoys mischief. She enjoys that delight, and we see that in like the conversation with John Waters and with Jack. You know, the talking about the sex clubs in New York, and talking about you know, LSD and sleeping with artists. Like, wouldn't it have been great? All those moments, that wicked sense of humor is also, it just makes it fun.
Right.
As we come to a close, I can't remember which of you described her this way, but it puts a kind of nice ending to this discussion, but also could be a model for how we think about moving forward in a productive way, that she's always called people in instead of calling them out. I can't remember that. I think maybe was you, Catherine. And there's something I think very profound about that at a moment like this, when there's so much, there is a lot of calling out and there is a lot of negativity, but instead thinking about a critical apparatus of calling in, of inviting in. So
that's a wonderful way, actually, even to sum up our conversation, is that we're not going to get anywhere by calling people out and leaving people out. We need everyone to have the critical thinking, to have the arts education, to have the vision in the future, to have confidence in themselves. And when I came out to Aggie, she said, I've known that since you were little. Like, why didn't you tell me? literally my answer. I was driving. I was like, why didn't you tell me? You could have saved me all this trouble. And she said, well, I was hoping for the best, but I'm just wondering about this woman you like. And she immediately started calling me in to her world. She was like, this is where I can connect with you. And even though I didn't think it was going to be good, because I thought you might get hurt, was really what she was saying. Not I was hoping for the best because I wanted a debutante, although I think she would have liked one of her 3 daughters. Debutante ball. But she was saying, you know, like, you are who you are, and I want to know more about that because you're part of my world. And she is part of my world. And when she says things, and Glenn and Tanya and you, Johanna, I mean, all of us who know her, all of us who know anyone, we're not perfect. We're not going to always say the right thing. We're not going to always already know. We don't all know. If we all knew, we would not be in this debacle right now. If, you know, we don't know. So we're figuring it out together. Tanya and I have been at this work for decades now together. We don't always make the right decisions on the broader world or in even our relationship or our collaboration. But if we stick with it and we keep working, we're going to end up moving forward. And I have to end, and I don't mean to like shout out whatever, but Ava DuVernay, who's 13th, made this piece. She took activism, made an art piece. And she made this piece, and this piece is what made Aggie start Art for Justice. And the only reason I made this film about my beloved mother was because she started Art for Justice, not all the other incredible things. I did it because she started Art for Justice. And because of that, Ava has posted about the movie on her Instagram. And she said that it was, this woman saw her film and it had this effect. You know, Glenn could like, what does it mean when someone sees your artwork and does something? And because of that, you can't imagine how many people not only have watched this trailer, but have written these incredible things. We need each other. We need each other right now. Here's a lot of people following Ava, Black artists, activists of all kinds, people who understand defunding the police, people who are trying to, you know, pursue abolition. All of the people who are writing, over 1,000 people have written that they love this idea that somebody is showing something you can do that will make the world better. And so, you know, I feel like part of the reason that people are glomming onto this on Ava's Instagram right now is because it provides an opening for anybody, for everybody. And it says we need everybody. We're calling in everyone in this movie. And art is what takes us there. That the art gives you an infinity. It gives you an endless place to go. And that's what Aggie's foreseeing. There's not like one thing you need to sign up for. Sorry, go ahead, Glenn.
Here, Kat. You know, preach. That's amazing. And so true.
It's probably a great place to wrap up, although I do feel like we could talk for much longer. And so I do want to just thank you, all of you, so very, very much for spending time with us, and for sharing your thoughts. And to also thank Marcus, who won more time in Strand Releasing, for offering us access to the film, which is tremendous. So on behalf of the Wex, we extend our gratitude to all of you and to everyone watching. And thank you for a really amazing evening.
Thank you so much.
Johanna.
This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Love the Wexner.
Yeah.